So by this point in the novel, let's see if it wants to load. There we go. So by this point in the novel, we've met several different characters. Edna, who has been with us from the start, and then we also know Robert, who came in right at the beginning, and now we have sort of a new character, Elsie. So we're going to look at the different ways that these characters are expected to behave based on the time period that they're in. So first of all, we need to understand different cultural views on promiscuity. So even in our current society, promiscuity is viewed differently depending on the gender of the person involved. Sometimes, right? So in some cultures and for some people, men are generally rewarded for having multiple sexual encounters and or sexual partners, whereas women are generally shamed for the same behavior. And sometimes we can see this even today, right? So these views were definitely alive and well in Victorian times, and they were pretty magnified, meaning that in Victorian times it would have been an even bigger deal for a woman to be promiscuous in any way, or even for people to think that she might have been promiscuous. Whereas men, they could sort of do what they wanted, and it was just expected. So that's definitely at play in the novel. So let's look at the characters individually. First, we have Robert, who we know from the very beginning as sort of a perpetual flirt. He's really well known for doting on a different woman every summer. He flirts unapologetically and openly. He chases women, proclaiming his, quote, love and devotion, even though everyone knows he's not serious. And he generally moves on to a different woman the following summer. Nobody is upset with him about this, and his reputation is totally fine. It's also implied that he has affairs with lots of women, but they're usually unmarried as far as we know. So we see, some jealousy between some of the unmarried women when they see him, flirting with somebody new. That sort of lets us believe that, he probably does have affairs with these women. But he does respect the boundary of I'll flirt with a married woman, but I won't actually have a real affair with her. So that's significant to notice about Robert. And remember, he's allowed to sort of play this role because he's a man. And in that culture, it's acceptable for him to flirt. Whereas if, say, Edna or Adele did this, it would absolutely not be acceptable. Then we have Elsie Arobin, who is a different character than Robert and a different sort of man. So Elsie takes flirtation to the next level. He sort of is seen as kind of preying on women, including those who are married, and he does not care about harming their reputation. So he will take flirting, to the next level and actually have affairs with these women, whether they're married or not. He actually has quite a reputation for it. He's well known for ruining women, hurting their reputations by having those affairs, and his behavior is somewhat frowned upon. So people don't want him to be hanging out with their wives, for instance. But he's still invited to parties. He's still allowed on the social scene. So he's not shunned for behaving this way. However, some people in the novel do notice that he is in some ways more dangerous than Robert because he doesn't have that boundary that he respects. He will take things to a physical level, go beyond flirting, and he doesn't care about ruining women's reputations. Then we have Edna. So we see in the novel that Edna does go ahead and participate in these same kinds of behaviors, right? She flirts with Robert. She even has an affair with Elsie, but she's judged very differently than the men because she's a woman. So her husband, Adele, the doctor even comments about it. Everybody who sees that she is flirting, and then certainly anybody who found out about her even being associated with Elsie, would be very concerned for her and would assume the worst, and this would be very damaging to her reputation. So not only by hanging out with these men, Is she hurting her reputation? But she also starts ignoring her social obligations. So she does things like she stops being at home to receive visitors, which would have been a very big deal in Victorian times. She stops listening to her husband as carefully, which again would have also been a very big deal. And she just sort of goes off the rails and starts doing what she wants, and she's really questioning, her place in society and what sorts of obligations she feels are things that she should pay attention to. And she's starting to kind of question those things and go in a different direction with her life and looking at her options. This is a huge deal for her. So she would have been seen as either hysterical, as was discussed briefly in some of the articles that you were given, and also in the lecture where we discussed Dr. Mandalay. So she could have been seen as hysterical, right? Like mentally ill, basically, for not liking her role in society. And she also would have been seen as kind of a fallen woman. So she would have been a source of shame for not only her husband and her family, but also for her extended family, like her father and, that whole family. So it would have been a very big deal what she's doing. So that's just something to sort of consider as we get towards the end of this novel, is to look at sort of what Edna's options are, and compare that also with what the options are that are available to the men. So, brief recap, we basically just have double standards everywhere, right? So certainly in Victorian times, and even now in some cases, different genders just had very different rules to follow. So while Edna is this fallen woman and a dishonor on her entire house, the men in the novel who behaved exactly the same way were not judged at all, or were not judged as harshly. So keep those things in mind when you're reading, and then when you're discussing the novel in your discussion board posts, and also when you're thinking about what you want to write about. These gender roles did play a huge role in sort of determining what kinds of lives different people could have. So definitely those double standards. Keep those things in mind when we get to the conclusion of the novel too. And we get to think about, what we think of how Edna handled this, this awakening that she had, and sort of what she did with that knowledge of her options and what she could do as a woman at the time. Okay, so as always, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, ask a tutor, and or talk with your groups.